Citizen 12 is brought to you by Complexify, a social purpose corporation founded to support you living in alignment with your conscience and discerning what that is. Find out more at complexify.org. Complexiphy.org.
My name is Paige Hulsey, and this is episode 1 of the Citizen 12 podcast. Citizen 12 is made by and for people interested in the practical application of spiritual principles as outlined in our steps, inspired by Alcoholics Anonymous. This is not a program or health treatment, but an inclusive place, common ground to share and learn. If you haven't yet listened to episode 0, we invite you to do that. You'll get a good sense of what this show is all about and hear our steps, which can also be found through any of our sites. Before we really dig in, our podcast is created in Seattle, Washington. We acknowledge this as Duwamish land and strive to honor the past, present, and future Indigenous lives here. Citizen 12 supports Duwamish tribal services by paying real rent. Find out more at realrentduwamish.org. The topic of this show is the third step: surrender how we live to what we trust to guide us. It might seem counterintuitive to begin this series at 3. We get that, and so I'll take a moment to share some background. I have related to the steps for a long time, more as like a slide on a playground than what calling them steps brings to mind. For me, that's a staircase. But with the playground slide, the first and second steps get you up to the top, and then 3 is like sitting at the top. And actually doing 3, or the third step, is letting go and being on my way down the slide. Except with the third step, it's not a casual decision like it is on a playground slide. For me, if I'm not game for steps 1, 2, and then 3, then I'm not down for, or kind of even eligible for 4 through 12. So what I'm saying is that I see 3 as pivotal foundation for applying the rest of the principles. So we're starting with 3. I don't know if there's a best way to start, so let's just make a beginning. And so I'm going to introduce my co-host, Emily. Hi, Emily.
Hello. Hi.
And we are going to talk about what I call parts of ourselves, and I'm going to do it from myself. So I'm going to talk about parts of myself. And the 3 kind of categories are body, my body, and mind, my mind. And then another thing that, at least for now, I'm going to probably refer to as my conscience. So the body, pretty self-explanatory. My feelings and urges and wants, desires, and likes and dislikes, preferences. And I'm going to even include things like gut reactions and like when we say, oh, well, this is what my heart wants. So I'm kind of umbrella all of that stuff under the body category. And then next I said mind, the mind category. So I think of this as all thoughts and thinking, analysis, my ability and my analyzing and managing things, that, any like thinking things through, and even consciousness and reason, intellect, all this group of things under the mind. And then probably, most critically for this conversation about intentional surrender to the thing we trust to guide us, is this third thing that gets called so many different things by different people, different beliefs, different cultures. Obviously, basic label would be spirit or soul, or maybe more commonly in our community, intuition or inspiration. But it looks to me like people often kind of call this part God or God consciousness. And lately, I have found myself most frequently referring to this thing as my conscience, or even just plain conscience. So any thoughts or clarifications immediately here with these categorizations?
I think that when it's interesting to know that you are bringing this word conscience up. I think that word is something that I really disliked for the longest time.
Interesting.
Yeah, because I think that I was like upset with that part of my, I think a lot of guilt comes up when you don't feel like you are following your conscience.
Okay.
So you start to sort of
dislike it.
Yeah.
You're like, set it aside.
Yeah. And so I got rid of that word.
Oh, okay.
And now it's back, and I'm interested to have, a new relationship with it, I think.
Does that mean you've been using some other word for this part of your... I mean, I know you well enough to know you haven't totally decided to ignore everything about you that isn't...
I hope not.
Okay, yeah.
Intuition, insight.
Intuition and insight. Okay, good. So really... my experience is that what works best is to go with the terminology and language that really works for people. And as we said in the intro to this podcast, we see that language is limited, particularly when we're trying to talk about these kind of topics, that we just don't even... maybe there's a language other than English that's better at talking about some of this stuff. I really only speak English. So, and I know English doesn't very well address these things, because many people would agree that, or think that intuition and conscience are different things. But in terms of this practice, I would say it totally works to just go with using intuition. So if that is, if you want to have an experience of, a new relationship to how you think of conscience, cool. But if not, I think working with the word intuition is totally workable.
I think so, but I am open to conscience, and I do think I can confuse intuition with impulses and body, too.
Very good, very good, very good. And we'll talk, later in the show, we'll talk about common pitfalls and hang-ups with these practices, and definitely distinguishing one category, body, from intuition is a good one, or mind from body, or mind from intuition. Yes, untangling the motivations and messages we're getting from these three parts of ourselves is key to this deal.
Can't wait.
Cool. There's a lot to unpack there, but let's press ahead for now. So now let's talk about what we're doing when we're not surrendering how we live to what we trust to guide us, that I call unintentional surrendering. So when we're unintentionally surrendering, I find that, again, the motivators are kind of in three categories. The first being reflexes, which for me, I would say includes habitual, like our habitual reactions, reflexes. The second category, feelings, which includes fear and wants. And then the third being our thinking or thoughts. So, how common is it that we hear, we say, why did you decide to go out with that guy? And you say, oh, well, I liked him. To some extent, that's probably semantics. We're very much in the habit of saying I did something because I wanted to. But the reality is that we also really mostly live that way too. We live from reflexes and our feelings and our thinking, and that is actually why this is kind of a radical spiritual practice, to do an intentional surrender of how we live to something other than our habits and feelings and thoughts. So just an example of having our thinking be in charge would be like, I've considered the results of a possible action, and then I feel like I've chosen or decided to do a particular thing. And, that's like having my thinking, unintentionally surrendering to my thinking. And I, we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but I'm a person who I don't wake up in the morning and say, okay, I surrender myself to my thoughts. That's not what I trust to guide me. I mean, obviously, effectively, I do frequently surrender how I live to my reflexes and feelings and thoughts, but my spiritual practice is not that. And so this is why we're talking about this, is that it's so useful to identify what we're mostly doing during how we actually live out our lives. Is there anything you want to say about that?
It sounds like you're saying that there is a time and place for responding to our thoughts, feelings.
Oh yeah, they're not bad.
No.
It's not that they're bad or invalid at all. I'm unfamiliar with anybody who has done away with them.
Imagine living your whole life just waking up and being like, what would you have me do? Whoever I trust, whatever I trust to guide me. Like I just can imagine that being a completely different. Would I even eat breakfast? You know what I mean? Like, so much is habit.
Yes. So, I want to say, I actually am someone who, made a decision a couple decades ago to surrender my whole life and how I live to my conscience, and not just my thinking, feelings, reflexes. So I feel like I do have a taste of what it's like to surrender my life. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Anything more about, like the distinction between reflexes or feelings?
So you would say that fear is a feeling that people are responding to?
Obviously you could see fear as both a reflex and a feeling. But, when we say, well, I can't go out to dinner like that because then I won't be able to make my rent. There's a bunch of stuff there. There's thinking, there's feeling, there might be habit. I'm not even sure that I don't spend a ton of time in the practice of trying to identify between these three things.
Right.
It's mostly being able to see when we're not surrendering to the thing we trust to guide us.
And that's kind of what came up for me, was that how do we learn to trust what to guide us,
Yeah.
How do we, why don't we trust our thoughts? Why don't we trust our feelings?
Yeah. And actually, that's what we're going to talk about next.
Right. Great.
To be clear, it isn't that I don't trust my thoughts and feelings. In fact, they're great, important, critical parts. I'm not sure we can live without them. And it isn't that they're bad. It's that, in my experience, and actually probably from a really young age, it was that it seemed like living from those things only, thoughts and feelings, gave me a pretty chaotic life, and accumulated in my actions with things that I really, regretted, things that felt like mistakes. I don't think it's a shock that living from our urges is probably not the highest, most ideal way of living. And I'm not talking about, that when you're hungry, you're going to eat. I'm talking about I want that, and then getting it. Obviously that's it's a pretty common barrier to living well. And I do have, I don't know if my reflexes or thinking are any worse or more problematic than another guy's, but I did find pretty young that they weren't, they certainly weren't contributing to a life of peace, and it was much more like turmoil and drama. And maybe what shows up most on the court in my life today is that when I find that I'm trying to think my way through how to make decisions or how to proceed with how I'm living, it's that it's exhausting more, maybe even more than tumultuous. It's tiring.
I agree. I have a lot of experience with, thinking my way through and trying to manage things with thoughts, and that does seem to be really related to just how tired I feel, because I'm just using so much energy planning but also I think I really am a feeler, and I can say that following impulses, following things that I really wanted, that I thought would feel very good, really have been some of the most painfully regretful experiences of my life.
I'm sorry. I mean, I feel for you, and I know just what you mean. And it is so complicated. It's complicated because, again, I don't think or see that it's that our wants are bad, but that I do see, and you are saying you agree, that when we have had those at the forefront, kind of unchecked by that third part of ourselves, the conscience, that the results are weird.
It's just weird. You kind of get the idea that you're not meant to live that way.
Well, you did, and I did. I mean, that's this is why we join each other in this spiritual practice of having something else guide us. So that actually leads me pretty naturally into that I'm just going to kind of share what I see as my third step story. So I'm going to start with that as a child, the word conscience, really, I think I just had a child's view of what that was. And all that somehow meant to me, I think, was like, don't lie. I don't know how I got that message.
Pinocchio.
But maybe Pinocchio, yeah. Definitely age appropriate there, 80s child. And so for me, as a little kid, I did lie. And then kind of, again, this immature way of thinking, I think I thought that I didn't really have a conscience because I found myself lying. And, I see this as kind of the beginning of my my story regarding my own relationship to my conscience. So the next kind of milestone that seems related is I'm going to say maybe around 10 or 11 when through the encouragement of my family and church accepted, or I can't really remember what they called it, I got saved. I invited Jesus Christ into my heart to be my savior and to forgive me, and I don't think I thought that had anything to do with my conscience then as a child. But now looking back, I think I did think that was going to have this profound effect on how I lived thereafter. And it didn't for me. It didn't really. I actually think I probably kind of had made that prayer for God to enter my heart many times in church and as a child. And the truth is I just don't see that it really did make any effective difference. Not that has been detectable to me. And then in my adolescence, I think the story gets a little more interesting because it was when I can actually recall that now what I see as my conscience really did start to talk to me. But the rest of me was so uninterested in what my conscience had to say that it really became my adversary. The kind of joke I tell about this is that, my conscience would say, Paige, don't get in that car. And I would say to my conscience, shut up, man. You leave me alone. Like, I'm doing what I want to do, and that was, really that began the next period where really I had all this strife, in trying to do what I felt like or wanted to do. And then having to kind of manage the outcomes of a life built on doing what I felt like doing or what I thought I should be doing. And then there was like all this consequence of trying to shut out my conscience or intuition. So because it really did seem like it was at odds with everything I cared about. I wanted to be cool and smart. And, I mean, I had all these ideas about how to live what I felt like and wanted. And it seemed more than often my conscience was trying to tell me something else. And I was not interested at all.
Mm-hmm. Like, why do you hate me?
Why do you hate me? That's a good question. Conscience, why do you hate me? And, unsurprisingly, over some time, that led to being put in a position where I actually did have to make a very big decision about how I was going to live. The consequences of living not connected to my full self, my conscience, they accumulated so much. And actually, I was 19 when I took a third step for the first time in 1999. Maybe I was 20, maybe it was 2000. I really did surrender how I lived. I really did make huge changes. It effectively wasn't the same as it had been as a child to ask God to come into my heart, because as an adult, albeit a young adult, when I took that third step, I really was saying, I want to live differently. I want to live in harmony with what's good and right, and set aside my personal thoughts and desires and wants and stuff. And I really kind of plugged along like that until I hit what I now see as kind of just another fork in the road in terms of, a decision was in front of me. And actually I was in a romantic relationship. I had been in many romantic relationships before and was again afterwards. But at this point, I really had this sense that my conscience was suggesting that I leave the relationship. And the rest of me said, no, thank you. During that period, I couldn't really see that very clearly. And it was only years later that I looked back and can see that that was a point where I separated from having my conscience guide me, very like on the court, right? The consequences of that accumulated. And I know I'm being a little vague here. This is public, we're sharing this podcast publicly, and I aim to share my stories in a way that is effective yet not, too invasive. But there were, consequences that accumulated, and a few years later, again, I was at another turning point where I was really going to have to deal with myself again. Do I want my do I want to live a life in alignment with the third step principles or not? Am I going to go on my own, or am I going to have surrender? Am I going to intentionally surrender? And actually, I feel like I really tried to surrender, and I felt like I kind of couldn't. And it was actually a couple of years of kind of doing a dance where I felt like I was really trying to surrender, but not actually doing it. Mm-hmm. And then it looks to me like it wasn't until 2011, until I made some big changes in my life, where I said, oh, yes, I want to surrender. I do. I surrender. I do not want to I will not honor my thoughts and feelings above my conscience, and started to put that into practice again. Mm-hmm. And that has, I'm very grateful to say that has been how it's been for the last, 7 years now. And just kind of a very brief example of how that's gone was with quitting smoking cigarettes. So in 2012, I was actually taking someone else through a third step, and we were talking about, how do we, some of these practices, how do we do this? How do we surrender intentionally how we live? And I have a meditation practice, and when I would get quiet in meditation in this period, my conscience started talking to me about maybe it was time to not smoke cigarettes anymore. And I loved smoking cigarettes. I actually smoked for 20 years. I smoked from when I was 12 years old until when I was 32. And I smoked about a pack a day, and that's a pretty good amount of smoking. And I did not want to quit smoking. I want to be really clear. I did not feel like quitting smoking. I wasn't thinking about quitting smoking. It's not like I was weighing it up, like I know it's a good thing to do and I should do it. That was not what was going on. It really was like my conscience was inviting me toward giving up smoking. And very frankly, my reflex was, no, thank you. That's nice input, conscience. Thank you so much. But I'm good. I like smoking. But fortunately, I have had then and still have practices in my life to kind of identify when I'm doing that. And I was like, well, crap, if I'm not going to abide by my conscience over this very clear, straightforward issue, how can I say I'm living a spiritual life where I'm, intentionally surrendering? And I gave up smoking, and I smoked for the last time in January of 2012. So that's, now been like 6 years.
I remember that.
You do?
I do, yeah.
Oh,
I came
cool.
over here to your house, and you told me, at that time you used the word God.
Mm.
God told me I should quit smoking, so I did. And I was just like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, isn't that nice? Like, yeah, like, wow. That was I haven't forgotten that.
Interesting.
And I only have like a handful of memories, and that is definitely one of them, because whoever says that and does it.
Yeah.
And yeah, that definitely stuck out to me, because I saw then, wow, Paige really is listening and following.
Yeah, right. Oh, thank you for saying.
How doesn't that's so hard? It can seem so hard.
It can seem so hard. Yeah, listening and abiding. I like those words, and I that I very much value that we're in a community where we're striving for that, where we value that, and we want to be doing that together. Mm-hmm. An even fresher kind of component of this for me was, I was injured in 2015. I got hit by a car on my bicycle on my daily commute, and was injured. And I love riding a bicycle, and it was like my preferred mode of physical activity. And I've really done a great job of recovering physically and emotionally through lots of effort. But recently, again, kind of in meditation, kind of in the quiet, I have had a sense about experimenting again with some other mode of physical activity. And I don't know. I want to say it's not as hard as quitting smoking, but in some ways, anytime my conscience is making a request of me or a suggestion or something, it feels hard, because the rest of me is the parts that feel like they're in charge all the time. So when I heard okay, why don't you think of maybe a rowing machine would be a good thing to try? It's like, I still have a little bit of kind of an adolescent attitude, really, I have to do a thing. I wasn't, I'm busy. But again, I'm really embedded in this spiritual practice. I stake my life on that. This is what matters to me. And honestly, I have a pretty lovely life, and it looks to me like this very basic foundation piece is what has made room for me to have this lovely life I have. Okay, so kind of going back to the content of what I was trying to talk about earlier. Now we want to talk about practices, third step practices. So as we are both people who have taken third steps, who live in this commitment to intentionally surrender, let's talk about the components of what we do to even kind of keep this practice alive. So first, I'm going to say kind of very basic, common would be prayer. You have a prayer routine around the third step?
Yes.
Yeah, so do I. And I'm going to include rituals that I know a lot of people who don't make prayers, but who do kind of a ritual or routine of meditation, or even just like putting their bodies into different positions. Like I'm thinking about, kind of being prostrate and meditating. So kind of physical manifestations of this practice. And for me, yeah, prayer and meditation both kind of fall into that. And then talking to other people about how we are surrendering or not surrendering, I'm going to say is a big component of how this practice stays alive in my life.
Absolutely.
And kind of along with that, I would include supporting other people doing surrendering. And you and I, our friendship would even be a good example of that. We have a friendship. We now have this working relationship together, and we do talk about where we're surrendering to what or not. And supporting each other, reminding ourselves that we both are people who have said we don't just want our automatic thoughts and feelings in charge of our lives, and that we are trying to do this other more intentional thing. And then that is going to include having this practice of noticing, this is kind of a funny thing to talk about, but I feel like it's really critical. So I think many of us who have this practice talk a lot about where we're not surrendering our lives to what we trust. But I have seen that it's really critical to also develop a practice of identifying where we are surrendering to what we trust. So taking the time to notice where we do make that space to have our conscience guide us, where we do abide by that guidance that we're getting. I have found that critical to encouraging more of it, and maintaining interest in abiding by my conscience. Maybe you'll tell us a little bit about what's going on with you currently with your whatever you see as your third step stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to. So a little bit of backstory. I think that it took me a big surrendering in the recent past to really start to be able to hear, and to be more to have more of an investment in this practice. And so I do feel very grateful that I've created enough space in my life to have it be more part of my life. So, and it comes up in littler and bigger ways, but so recently, and this is not easy to talk about because the fresh ones are usually just a little harder.
Okay.
This is a fresh one. Absolutely. You. And I think, because it does feel so raw that it might be a good topic. So yesterday I went birthday present shopping for my little sisters, and this is something I had been planning to do for quite some time. And just because I've been planning to do something doesn't mean that I'm following something that I trust.
Sure.
Yeah, and that's important for me to know.
Sure. And probably all the categories of ourselves were at play, right? So
right.
You want to shop for your sisters. You feel like shopping for them. You thought about it's a good thing for a sister to do. And there is probably some inspiration to show up in a way of caring for your siblings.
Right.
Okay.
Absolutely. All of the above.
But maybe not, you weren't thinking about what motives you had.
No, it was like, this is something I want to do. And so I'm going to do it.
Okay.
Not much thought was put in, not much conscious thought was put in. Intentional.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and this does happen a lot. So it wasn't until after I had gone out and, made a day of it and, that I was able to reflect on it and to think, wait a second, maybe me spending more than I know I can afford on those things wasn't
not quite the right ideal thing.
Not quite. Maybe that wasn't right. Maybe I have to consider returning a couple of the things. And that's annoying.
Sorry to laugh.
It's just annoying because it's like, man, it's not what I had in mind. And I'm not saying I'm going to do that, but I think today what's different is that I laid in bed and it came up for me, and I gave it some time, and I considered it. Maybe that is something that I need to do, and I said a prayer, and I think that's the spot that is like, I can be more like, that's where I find a lot of kindness with myself in that moment where I'm like, please, if it's right that I return these shoes, let me know. And that gives me a little bit of time too, so I don't have to because it can be
like not do another reflexive thing of just returning them because you had the thought you should.
Yeah.
But actually seeking some clarification about what's right to proceed.
Exactly. And, maybe I'm afraid that I spent too much money, and maybe I'm having a lot of thoughts. Okay, it doesn't make logical sense that you would spend X amount of money on birthday presents, therefore this was the wrong idea. That's not another thought-based thing. Yeah. So giving it some time, because maybe the right thing isn't that I return it, but at least I'm
making the space. Making the space to not just do the automatic. I think that's an awesome example. And I really appreciate you being vulnerable about it. I know that when, like you were saying, these fresh things, especially when we can't tell it, see how great I am at doing my spiritual practice.
No, it's embarrassing.
It can feel embarrassing. But and then I suspect there might be people who would listen to this and think kind of how silly or small this kind of not fretting over it, but some people might move through life and never give a second thought to a purchase they made and feel like that's a good way to live. But actually, you and I both have some reasonable parameters to money with money, and it is actually appropriate to give some consideration and not just do whatever we feel like or whatever the automatic is.
Yeah, I that's just not a way that I can live. I mean, and I don't think I've ever lived that way. If it wasn't putting in intentional thought, it was living in remorse and self-hatred. There was some sort of response to my actions. I wasn't just doing it and then forgetting and moving on freely and happily. No.
Yeah.
So this is better than the remorse and self-hatred. This is okay, maybe I didn't do the best thing. So
now what?
Yeah.
So now what? Yeah. Yeah. I think that pretty easily leads into to our next topic, which is kind of a category of the show that I think will come up again and again, what I refer to as common hang-ups and pitfalls associated with this work, with this, and of course here we're still talking about the third step. So, and you kind of just touched on it. The first common thing I've identified that I myself and many other people have trouble with in the practice of this step is getting stuck on what to surrender to. And sometimes that might mean well, what is conscience? What is God? How do you know what that is? Why would I even be interested in doing that? I mean, there's people, I know people who've spent years of their lives spending more time on that. Well, what is it that I have to surrender to?
That's a good question.
And it's totally a valid question. And my experience is that I had to settle that adequately for myself to be able to proceed. These days, I find that it's not the barrier that it used to be, that I have proceeded with being interested in surrendering to my conscience more than dealing with, well, is that supernatural, or is that just a part of myself, or is that intuition, or is it psychic? Is it located in my body? Is it not? These things currently are not of the highest interest to me. And functionally, it doesn't look like it makes that much of a difference. These practices that we have seem pretty good and effective wherever they're coming from. And what you were talking about, in your consideration about returning purchases, and you were saying, okay, there's some fear, there's some thoughts, some feelings, you've got this stew of motives, and everything in my life says that is totally how it goes. Just like I described with the smoking, of course I had thoughts and feelings and wants and all kinds of motives, competing and overlapping motives about that. And back to one of our practices being talking to other people, talking through what these competing motives are as a way of practicing the third step has been critical for me. Sometimes it's not that hard to untangle them. Like, honestly, when I was getting that guidance about quitting smoking, it was not unclear to me. I could pretty readily tell that this wasn't coming from like my ego. My ego wanted to keep smoking. But that untangling of is this just fear, or are these just thoughts, or is this just cultural expectation? This is the lifelong practice of this. I think we both have found that some of that has come a little more easily after we've had practice at doing it, that in the beginning it was very complicated seeming and
so complicated,
totally unclear. I don't think we had ever really thought about, we just had lived in reflex, and so we hadn't really had to do this untangling of what is a reflex versus what is more intentional. And I've never found some quick trick about it. I definitely have heard people report that, what do people say? Like, well, if my mind says do a thing, then I just do the opposite.
And I'm like, no.
That doesn't necessarily work.
I don't want to live that way either. Geez. I guess I'd be willing to if I knew that was right.
If it was reliable, yes, maybe. But I have not found, sometimes my mind says good stuff. Like, what if my mind had been saying quit smoking? Plenty of people's thoughts do tell them that. So then I just do the opposite? No, that's going to be goofy.
Yeah.
So really, I have never met a surefire way to ensure that we are abiding by our conscience. Again, this is why we have practices that support it. But I don't know of any quick trick to know if we're doing the right thing. So another common pitfall that I have seen in my life and that I see in others is what I refer to as doing the practice, but then not actually surrendering on the court. And this is, maybe I'll go back to even the story about leaving that relationship. I had a practice of making a prayer about like surrendering my life at the time. In fact, yesterday before you went shopping, I'm going to bet that you actually made a prayer saying,
I pretty much probably said a third step prayer.
And then went out into your life and did reflexes and feelings.
So it must have been all God.
Oh, well, that's just kidding, right? That's a common, in a lot of, we might have to save that.
I wish it was that easy.
I wish it was that easy too. And maybe we'll have to save that for another day. But actually that, getting confused that just because something happens, meaning that was the right thing, there's a whole world of, actually, let's write down that we will talk about that at a future time. Because I think we do hear so much of that. If it happened, that meant that it was the right thing.
So if it happens, then it's God's will.
Well, yeah, that's, we definitely hear people talk like that. But I just want to say a little bit more about this, doing the practice, but not actually surrendering, that I, in my life, I saw and felt how damaging that was, because it made it seem like it didn't work. It made it seem like abiding by my conscience wasn't valuable or working, because it was like, well, I'm saying I want to do the right thing. It's like I didn't have any explanation for why things were still chaotic and exhausting. I was not being but now in retrospect I can identify that I wasn't being responsible for where I still was just doing what I wanted to do, or being willful. That's another way we talk about it.
Right. It's more clear looking back. I remember being pretty happy. So I too was in a relationship that I had the insight to leave, and I remember being really happy about getting to a place where I was like, okay, well, I'm just not willing now to do the right thing.
Okay.
And there was some freedom in that for me, because at least I was being honest about it.
Yeah. How did that look for you?
It looked like a long time of saying that prayer, please give me the strength to do what I need to do.
Okay.
And eventually I was given that strength. But but it took a while, and but being honest about it was there was some relief there, because then I could be like, okay, well, what's getting in the way? Yeah.
Not just pretending this is me trying to do the right thing and it's just not working out.
No, it's like, I'm not willing yet. Why not?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think I definitely relate to that. Mm-hmm. So another component that I have identified, another hang up with practicing the third step is, trying to do it on our own, trying to identify where we are or aren't abiding by our conscience, or, just, being isolated, doing it all on our own. Mm-hmm. And we already said that one of our practices is including others in this deal. And for me, that means, trusted friends and advisors, and really the people who are closest to me in my life are very clear that how I have chosen to live is not just my whims and preferences and urges and feelings and stuff. Mm-hmm. So I mean, I'm grateful to say I really have developed kind of a community in my life where people, I don't get to do this on my own anymore.
Yeah. To me, this is one of, if not the most important, because I can still be pretty dishonest with myself, and,
Me too.
And yeah, I mean,
doing it on our own is
going to
make lots of space for that.
Yeah. So it really helps to have people I trust, and, to check in with them. And usually when I'm like we talked about earlier in a separate conversation, if I'm reaching out to someone unsure about something, there's probably something there that deserves to be looked at.
And we can talk it out if there is or not, and look together in light of our shared experience.
Mm-hmm. Right.
The last and maybe even the most common in the early days, in fact, I would say for myself, certainly the biggest difficulty with this practice, like for the first bunch of years, was entirely forgetting that this was something I was even trying to be interested in doing.
Yeah.
And I kind of joke, but like I used, for a long time, I would kind of go to my spiritual advisor and, blah, 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 go through all of the stuff, difficulties and troubles and concerns I was having. And then, they'd be like, hey, man, do you remember God? Remember like the whole basis of what we were doing here together was going to be like not Paige's mind and feelings. Remember that other thing? And it, I mean, I don't know. I think I probably was embarrassed that I even with a ton of practices to try to keep that alive, it just like fell out of existence. Mm-hmm. I would like make a prayer, and then 2 seconds later, I would not be related to that. I was trying to live out the prayer, and it's, and it still happens. It still happens now that I look back at my day and I see where I have behaved out of, automatic reflex and thoughts and feelings. But it's a lot less common that I have entirely forgotten that this is what I'm doing. And I do attribute that to not just a practice with prayer, but I'm going to say having all the people around me know that that's how I'm trying to live, and supporting other people living, having their conscience lead them. This makes it nearly impossible to forget about.
Yeah.
But obviously forgetting that we're interested in doing it would be a barrier to doing it.
Absolutely. But it is common. So common.
Yeah. Finally, we want to talk about some of the benefits of intentional surrender to what we trust to guide us. Did I just say the word fruit? The fruit of surrendering. I really do see that it. It's not. This is a spiritual deal. So this is not like a linear. You input this and then you output a result, because I just haven't found that that's how this works. I have not found that this works like a vending machine where I like insert the prayer and out comes the relief. I mean, Paige's mind and body wants things to work that way, it seems like, but that is not how that's not what it has seemed like. It more seems like when I'm engaged in this spiritual practice that there are like results that arise along with these practices. And these days, the thing that feels most valuable to me, seems most valuable, is the amount of peace of mind. And you actually described the regret of when you were just kind of living in reflex, or not even considering not living in reflex. And now I know that you and I both, we just don't live with that kind of even despair over did we do the wrong thing. Not like we don't live with a practice of self-reflection as we've described, but that worrying, nagging, gnawing, anxiety. Well, I just don't have it. I just don't have it anymore. So I'm going to say peace of mind. And now, I mean, people really know me as someone who very deeply values peace of mind. And I actually even, I mentioned the rowing machine. When I got the rowing machine, I really kind of, people assume you want to like lose weight when you start a new exercise. And honestly, I mean, losing weight may or may not be good for me, but I know enhanced peace of mind is a good thing for me, and that satisfying my conscience contributes to peace of mind for me. And then the other ways I kind of noted that the other benefits of living this practice would be like feeling like we're in the flow of life, like we're connected, and like I don't know. Is that really that different than being satisfied? I don't know. But that kind of feeling like we're on track, doing as we should be doing. I don't know. It's a different, I don't even know if I'd had very much of that in my life.
Yeah. And I think I can say, I know it's real because I know what it's like to not feel that way.
To not have it.
Yeah.
To know we're off track.
To know you're off track. And then, oh my gosh, to see other people that I love feeling off track, I can, it's real. And yeah, today, that's not how I feel anymore. And it does kind of feel like a miracle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to make sure we're clear. We do still know what it's like to feel off track.
Oh yes.
And
right. Totally.
But that
on a daily basis. Yeah.
But that we do have these practices that have provided us with big patches of life where we do feel on track, where we do feel connected and in the flow of life. Like sometimes it feels like green lights. Like I've got green lights to proceed, and I really didn't have much of that in my life.
Yeah, sparse. It was pretty sparse.
Yeah.
And yes, it's definitely not a constant thing for me.
Yeah, intermittent. And I check in on it. And it's, so, it speaks to why this is just an ongoing practice. I made one prayer a very long time ago. Actually having it be alive in my life in a way that makes a difference is maybe even a moment by moment practice that I'm not bummed about anymore. There was a time when even that seemed like a burden.
Yeah.
But the fruit seems good enough that I'm game to keep doing it. And even I would say delight in that. It's a pleasure to watch you as, you and others choose to honor your conscience over your whims and urges. Like, it's beautiful. I have watched big changes in your life and other people's lives. It's pretty sweet.
You. That's nice to hear.
Yeah. Well, that I suspect we'll come back to these topics again, but that's all for now. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Yes.
It looks to us as though our community could really use this content, and we're excited to create and share it. If you already like what you're hearing, or even if you don't, but you think what we're up to is good, please consider contributing through our Patreon at patreon.com/C12POD. That's C12POD. And support us by subscribing to our show through whichever tool you use to listen to podcasts. And if you're up for it, submit a review on iTunes and or Facebook or wherever you listen to the show. We're also hosting Discord spaces for patrons, and we'll include a Dear Citizen segment in future shows. So support us and write in with your questions about practicing the principles of the steps. Everyone is invited to please find us online, chime in, and write to us. We're We're all over the internet. We're on Instagram and Facebook, SoundCloud, and Twitter, all at C12POD. Thank you to everyone who contributes to this work.